In central Kentucky, the land appears unbroken at first glance. Low hills stretch across the horizon, covered in hardwood forest and seasonal grass. The surface is quiet, shaped gradually over millions of years. Beneath it, however, the ground is not solid in the way it seems. The region sits atop a vast limestone formation, slowly dissolved by water moving through cracks in the rock. Over time, these narrow fractures widened into passages. Passages became tunnels. Tunnels expanded into chambers. The result is an underground system that extends for hundreds of miles, much of it unseen, some of it still unmapped. Air moves differently below the surface. Temperatures remain constant, unaffected by the seasons above. Light does not exist beyond the entrance zones. Sound carries in unusual ways, sometimes sharp, sometimes distant. Movement is restricted by the shape of the stone itself. In the early 20th century, this landscape drew explorers, not for science alone, but for opportunity. The growing interest in cave tourism turned hidden spaces into potential sources of income. New passages meant new attractions. Each undiscovered tunnel carried the possibility of something marketable. But the terrain did not change to accommodate those who entered it. The passages remained narrow where they had formed that way. The ceilings remained unstable where erosion had weakened them. There were no markers in the deeper sections. No mapped certainty. Only darkness, extending inward. Floyd Collins was born in 1887 in the rural countryside of Kentucky, near the cave-rich region that would later define his life. He grew up in an environment where caves were not unusual features, but familiar parts of the landscape. From an early age, he developed a practical understanding of underground spaces, moving through them with a level of confidence built on repetition rather than formal training. By the early 1920s, cave exploration in Kentucky had begun to shift. What had once been informal discovery was becoming structured around tourism. Mammoth Cave, already known for its size, attracted visitors from across the country. Private landowners and independent explorers saw an opportunity to compete by finding new entrances or entirely separate cave systems that could be open to paying visitors. Collins became part of this movement. He was not employed by a large operation, nor backed by significant financial support. Instead, he worked independently, often with the help of family members. His approach was methodical. He would locate small openings, sometimes no wider than a person's shoulders, and follow them deeper into the limestone. When necessary, he widened passages using basic tools. Progress was slow, but consistent. In 1917, Collins discovered Crystal Cave on his family's property. The cave contained formations that were considered visually striking, including gypsum crystals that reflected light in unusual ways. He attempted to turn it into a tourist destination, but its remote location, combined with limited access to main roads, reduced the number of visitors. Financial returns remained low. This outcome influenced his decisions in the years that followed. Rather than abandoning exploration, Collins focused on finding another cave, one that was closer to established travel routes. Accessibility became as important as discovery itself. The goal was not only to locate a new passage, but to secure a position within a growing commercial landscape. By January 1925, Collins had identified an area near Mammoth Cave where he believed a new system might exist. The site would later be known as Sand Cave. Initial openings suggested the presence of deeper passages beyond. As before, the entrance was narrow, requiring careful movement to proceed. There was no indication at the surface that the passage would behave differently from others he had explored. The rock formation appeared stable. The opening, though tight, was navigable. Conditions were consistent with previous experiences. Collins prepared to enter alone, carrying a carbide lamp for light. This was standard practice for him. Solitary exploration reduced logistical complexity and allowed for uninterrupted movement through confined spaces. On January 30, 1925, he began another descent into the limestone. On January 30, 1925, Floyd Collins entered Sand Cave through a narrow opening at the base of a hillside. The entrance led into a series of tight passages, consistent with the early stages of cave formation in limestone terrain. Movement required a controlled approach. In many sections, Collins could not stand upright. Progress was made by crawling or sliding forward through confined spaces. He advanced deeper into the cave, following a passage that gradually constricted. The walls narrowed, and the ceiling lowered to a point where only a single body could pass through at a time. This type of formation, often referred to as a crawlway, was not unusual in the region. Collins had navigated similar conditions before. At a distance estimated to be more than 50 feet from the entrance, he reached a section where the passage angled downward. To continue, he moved headfirst into a tighter opening. The space beyond appeared to widen slightly, suggesting the possibility of a larger chamber further ahead. As he shifted his body forward, a rock dislodged from the ceiling behind him. The movement was sudden and localized. The stone, weighing several kilograms, fell into the narrow passage and pinned his left leg against the wall. The positioning of his body, angled downward, with limited room to adjust, prevented immediate escape. Collins attempted to free himself by pushing against the surrounding rock. The confined space restricted leverage. The passage allowed little room to reposition his torso or apply force in a different direction. The rock remained fixed. At this stage, his carbide lamp was still functioning, providing a limited circle of light. Airflow continued through the passage, indicating that the cave remained connected to the surface. There was no immediate collapse beyond the initial rockfall. However, the situation had changed in a fundamental way. Movement backward was blocked by the stone pressing against his leg. Movement forward was restricted by the narrowing of the passage ahead. The space around him did not allow for standing, turning, or significant adjustment. Collins was alone, immobilized, in a section of cave not visible from the entrance. The conditions were stable, but unchangeable. Floyd Collins remained in the position where the rock had pinned his leg, angled downward in a confined section of Sand Cave. His body was wedged within a passage too narrow to permit turning or standing. The space allowed only limited movement of his arms and upper torso. His left leg, trapped beneath the fallen rock, could not be withdrawn. At the time of the incident, Collins carried a carbide lamp, which produced light through a chemical reaction between calcium carbide and water. This was a standard source of illumination for cave exploration in that period. The lamp provided a small, steady flame, sufficient to see the immediate surroundings but not beyond the confines of the narrow passage. Initial efforts to free himself were unsuccessful. The rock that pinned his leg was positioned in a way that distributed its weight against both the cave wall and his limb. The confined space limited the angles from which he could apply force. Without the ability to reposition his body, leverage was minimal. Collins remained in this condition for an extended period before he was discovered. When he did not return, concern grew among those familiar with his work. A search was initiated, and he was eventually located inside the cave. Reaching him required navigating the same narrow passages he had entered, which slowed progress. Once found, rescuers established communication. The passage leading to Collins was too tight to allow multiple people to work simultaneously. Individuals had to move in sequence, often crawling through constricted sections before reaching the point where he was trapped. This limited the efficiency of any rescue effort. Food and water were delivered in small quantities. Items had to be passed carefully through the narrow spaces, sometimes using containers or improvised methods to ensure they could reach him without spilling. The supply was irregular at first, depending on the ability of rescuers to access his position. Temperature inside the cave remained relatively constant, estimated to be around 54 degrees Fahrenheit, approximately 12 degrees Celsius. While this prevented extreme fluctuations, it also meant prolonged exposure to cold conditions. Collins' position, partially immobilized and unable to generate significant body heat through movement, increased the risk of hypothermia over time. Lighting conditions changed as his carbide lamp was eventually extinguished. After this point, Collins relied on light brought in by rescuers. When they were not present, he remained in complete darkness. The absence of light was continuous and absolute, interrupted only during brief periods when someone reached him. Rescue efforts focused initially on removing the rock that held his leg. However, the confined nature of the passage made it difficult to apply tools effectively. Digging or prying actions risked dislodging additional material, which could worsen the situation. The structure of the cave in that section was not stable enough to guarantee safe manipulation. As attempts to directly free him proved difficult, alternative strategies were considered. One approach involved widening the passage to allow better access. This required removing sections of rock along the route leading to Collins. Progress was slow due to the need to maintain structural stability while working in tight conditions. Communication between Collins and the rescuers continued during the early stages. Reports from the time indicate that he was responsive and aware of the situation. Information exchange was practical, focused on his condition and the efforts being made to reach him. There is limited documentation of extended conversation, and details remain constrained by the circumstances in which they occurred. Outside the cave, attention to the situation began to grow. News of the trapped explorer spread beyond the local area, drawing increasing numbers of people to the site. Journalists arrived, and the event began to receive national coverage. Despite this, the conditions inside the cave remained unchanged. Access was still restricted to a small number of individuals who could physically navigate the passage. As days passed, the physical strain on Collins increased. Circulation in his trapped leg was compromised due to sustain from the rock. The inability to move freely contributed to stiffness and gradual loss of function. His upper body remained active to a limited extent, but overall mobility continued to decline. The delivery of supplies became more organized over time. Rescuers established a more consistent method for bringing water and small amounts of food. However, the quantities were limited by what could be transported through the narrow passage. There was no possibility of providing substantial nourishment or medical treatment under those conditions. Efforts to widen the access route continued, but each modification required careful consideration. The risk of further collapse remained present. In some areas, supports were introduced to stabilize sections of the passage. This added complexity to the work, as materials had to be carried in manually and installed within confined spaces. Collins' exposure to darkness and isolation persisted throughout this period. The absence of a natural day-night cycle removed external markers of time. His awareness of duration depended largely on the intervals between visits from rescuers. These intervals varied based on the progress of work and the physical limitations of those entering the cave. The situation remained stable in one sense: Collins was alive, and access to him, though difficult, was still possible. At the same time, no immediate solution had been achieved. The constraints imposed by the cave structure continued to limit all efforts. The environment did not change. The passage remained narrow. The rock remained in place. Time continued to pass without resolution. As rescue efforts continued inside Sand Cave, the conditions surrounding Floyd Collins began to deteriorate. The narrow passage that allowed access to his position remained unstable. Each attempt to widen it carried the risk of further collapse. Despite these constraints, work proceeded, limited by both the physical structure of the cave and the tools available at the time. Several days into the rescue, a secondary collapse occurred within the passage leading to Collins. This event blocked the already restricted route, cutting off direct access to him. Debris filled sections of the crawlway, making it impossible for rescuers to reach his position using the original path. Communication, which had been intermittent but present, was abruptly severed. The collapse marked the turning point. Until that moment, despite the difficulty, there had been a functional link between Collins and those attempting to reach him. Afterward, the situation shifted from direct assistance to indirect effort. Rescuers could no longer deliver food or water. They could not assess his condition. The space that connected him to the outside had closed. In response, a new strategy was initiated. Rather than attempting to clear the blocked passage, which was considered too dangerous, teams began digging a vertical shaft from the surface. The goal was to reach a chamber adjacent to Collins' location and approach him from a different angle. This method required significant labor and time. The digging process was slow. Workers had to cut through layers of soil and rock, stabilizing the shaft as they progressed downward. Equipment was limited, and much of the work relied on manual effort. The site above ground became increasingly crowded, as volunteers, engineers, and observers gathered. The operation drew national attention, with continuous reporting on its progress. Despite the scale of activity above, the conditions below remained unchanged. Collins was still confined in the same position, now without contact. The duration of this isolation extended beyond the period during which he had previously received supplies. Estimates of his condition could only be made indirectly, based on known factors such as temperature, lack of water, and restricted circulation. Medical understanding at the time suggested that survival under such conditions would be limited. Without water, the human body begins to decline within a matter of days. Combined with immobility and cold exposure, the likelihood of continued survival decreased steadily. The shaft continued downward, but progress did not match the urgency of the situation. Technical challenges slowed the work. Adjustments had to be made to maintain safety, further extending the timeline. Each delay reduced the probability that Collins could still be alive. Reports from the period indicate that by the time rescuers approached the level where Collins was believed to be located, more than 2 weeks had passed since the initial collapse. The absence of communication throughout that time left no confirmation of his condition. When access to his position was finally re-established, Collins was no longer responsive. Observations made at the scene indicated that he had died before rescuers were able to reach him. The exact timing of his death could not be determined with precision, but it was understood to have occurred several days prior. The effort to save him had continued without interruption. The outcome had not changed. By mid-February 1925, the vertical shaft had reached the depth required to approach Floyd Collins from an adjacent section of sand cave. The excavation, carried out over several days, had passed through layers of soil and limestone before connecting to a chamber near the location where he was trapped. Rescuers entered through this newly created access point and moved toward the narrow passage that contained Collins. The conditions inside remained consistent with earlier reports: confined space, low temperature, and complete darkness beyond the reach of artificial light. When they reached him, Collins showed no signs of life. His body remained in the same position in which he had been trapped, angled within the narrow passage, his leg still pinned beneath the rock that had fallen days earlier. The space around him had not changed. There was no indication that he had been able to shift his position after the secondary collapse cut off access. Medical examination at the site was limited due to the constraints of the environment. However, it was determined that he had died before rescuers were able to reach him through the shaft. The exact cause of death could not be established with certainty, though dehydration, exposure, and restricted circulation were all considered contributing factors. The recovery of his body presented a separate challenge. The passage in which he was trapped remained too narrow to allow for safe extraction. The position of the rock and the surrounding formation made removal difficult without risking further collapse. Initial efforts to retrieve him were unsuccessful. Given these conditions, a decision was made to leave the body in place temporarily. The cave entrance was later sealed, effectively making the site both a recovery location and a point of containment. This decision reflected the limitations of available methods and the risks associated with continued excavation in an unstable structure. In the months and years that followed, additional attempts were made to recover Collins' remains. Some of these efforts succeeded in partially accessing the area, but full recovery remained complex. Reports indicate that his body was eventually removed more than a year later, though not without further difficulty. The site of Sand Cave remained altered by the events. The shaft, the collapsed passage, and the sealed entrance marked the location where the rescue effort had taken place. The conditions that had defined the incident, narrow space, unstable rock, and limited access, remained unchanged. The death of Floyd Collins in February 1925 did not end at the cave itself. The event extended beyond Sand Cave, becoming one of the first widely followed rescue attempts in the United States. Newspapers across the country reported on the effort in near real time. Updates were carried daily, sometimes hourly, as information emerged from the site. For many readers, the incident unfolded as a continuous account rather than a distant report. The scale of attention marked a shift in how such events were observed. Large numbers of people traveled to the area during the rescue attempt, gathering near the site. Infrastructure developed temporarily to support the influx. What had begun as a local effort became a national focus. In the years that followed, the incident influenced both public awareness and technical approaches to confined space rescue. Methods for dealing with cave-ins, restricted passages, and underground entrapment were studied more closely. While progress was gradual, the need for specialized techniques became more widely recognized. Floyd Collins himself became part of regional history. His work as an independent cave explorer reflected a period when exploration operated at the boundary between opportunity and risk, without formal systems of safety or support. The conditions he faced were not unusual for that time, but the outcome revealed their full consequence. Sand Cave remains in Kentucky, largely unchanged in its structure. The passages continue beneath the surface, shaped by the same processes that formed them over millions of years. The location is marked, but not transformed. There are no alterations that redefine what the cave is. The space where Collins was trapped still exists as it was, narrow, fixed, and inaccessible without significant effort. His story remains as a record, not of a single moment, but of a sequence that could not be reversed once it began. If you found this account valuable, you can continue exploring documented survival histories by subscribe the channel.